Hey YouTube, it's Spacepan. I just have a quick topic that I wanted to address. And actually, I would be interested to see if anybody else has made this comparison. I doubt I'm the first one. Certainly not the first one to, for example, use the term feminazi, which was coined by Rush Limbaugh. And what often happens in these conversations is people will accuse people of hyperbole, right? They'll say, oh, feminists aren't Nazis. That's really, really unfair. You're just doing what all the SJWs are doing right now and calling everybody that you disagree with Nazis, right? Now, the problem with calling people Nazis when they're not Nazis or when they're not that bad and making the comparison when they're not that bad is that if it's not true, then yeah, it's ridiculously hyperbolic, it's really unfair, it's really unproductive. But I think I can make the case, and I'm serious, no, I really do mean it, that feminism does not compare favorably to Nazism. I'm not just being an edgelord piece of shit, and I believe that I've found an argument or a comparison that really, really makes this clear. I call it the male question. So a lot of you might be familiar with the JQ, the Jewish question, particularly if you follow like the alt-right and follow things like that. You know, it's a constant discussion. It's a constant debate, actually, that's been coming up a lot. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the JQ is not really a conspiracy that all Jews are secretly plotting to overthrow things. It seems to be more along the lines that Jews tend to have an in-group preference, right? And then they, take arguments based on the disproportionate influence of Jews to try to create to make the case that way. So my point is that it's not necessarily this huge black and white thing. Now, obviously, the alt-right doesn't seem to be taking it to the degree that they actually advocate genocide. It seems they more advocate separation. Of course, separation backed by government force, so wherever you want to put that morally. That's not really the topic of this video. The reason I offer that background is because I'm going to be drawing a comparison from the JQ to the MQ, the male question, or patriarchy theory. Now, patriarchy theory has different meanings in different contexts, and basically the feminist version of it was stolen, like from anthropology. When you use the term in other fields, you may be specifically referring to patriarchal family structures, where you have like a male head of the household. However, as you're probably familiar, the patriarchy theory under feminism is more so a threat narrative constructed to impute malice upon people for being male. It essentially accuses all males of having an in-group preference that favors other males and in acting upon that in order to give undue influence to other males. And what feminists tend to do is they'll point at, for example, representation in government, and they'll say, well, look, if males are roughly 50% of the population, if we're not seeing roughly 50-50 in terms of representation, then obviously sexism, right? So just from that, I think you can kind of see that there's very, very similar parallels with those, with those two narratives. Now, let's say you're somebody who actually is convinced that there is something to the JQ and that there is a legitimate concern there and we need to talk about it. Well, from that perspective, do you think that feminist patriarchy theory meets that bar? Like, would you say that the feminist narrative directed at males, would you say that that's a very compelling or very convincing narrative? Or, even more importantly, if you're somebody who thinks the JQ is just absolute racist bullshit, then do you think the same thing or something similar about feminist patriarchy theory? My argument is that I think that there's more legitimacy to the JQ. Even if you think the JQ is absolute bullshit, I think it's actually still very easy to see that people who make JQ-style arguments at least have a little bit more to work with than these people who are making a narrative constructed against all men. But then consider this. Let's work from the perspective that assumes both threat narratives are bullshit. So the JQ threat narrative is bullshit, the MQ threat narrative is this bullshit, right? So the Jewish question targets Jews. It targets that small percentage, that small portion of the human population. Patriarchy theory threatens males. And it doesn't just threaten males in any particular time and place. It threatens males at their core. It attacks men at their absolute core. They're naturally this way. They have toxic masculinity, right? And even if their arguments are primarily rooted in culture or in social things and things like that, in other words, to say that it's not an essential characteristic of men, what this essentially translates into is that the culture is so toxically masculine that it's able to just across the board indoctrinate just about everybody. So when people refer to patriarchy theory as very conspiratorial, I think the shoe fits. I think it's actually quite accurate. You can play 6 degrees of separation to try to find some sort of male aggressor or some sort of male violence, but it is just that. It's a game of 6 degrees of separation, and very often the influence of women, the agency of women, is completely taken out of the conversation. If you elevate male and female agency to the same level, where you're trying to perceive both of them, what you'll often find is that you can't really construct male oppression or authority unless you're just completely ignoring all of the female agency involved. My point, in a nutshell, is that patriarchy theory, the MQ, the male question, on one level, I believe that the evidence supporting it is weaker than the JQ. And again, you don't even have to think the JQ has a leg to stand on. If it even can kneel sort of on a stub, that's I think that's more support than we can find for patriarchy theory. Then move into the second element of this is the number of people that it targets. There's absolutely no question that this feminist narrative, this feminist MQ, is a threat narrative targeted at far more people. And I would argue this is it's an accusation. It's kind of an act of fraud against that many people. And when you stop and really try to think, this isn't 50% of all humans who are alive today. This isn't 50% of 7 billion. This is 50% of all humans who have ever existed. Right? I'm not even going to try to fathom the number. It's too hard. It's too difficult. I probably could Google like how many humans have ever existed and then like cut it in half, but that's too hard. Maybe later.
Hi bitch, 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 hi bitch.
The third dimension to then consider is how much was it believed? Because I could, for example, throw out a narrative that says everybody who's not me is just like a total fucking murderous scumbag. And then by my own metric, well, I just accused more people and have even less evidence. But the reason I wouldn't be as bad is because I wouldn't be able to convince people of that. And that's the real piece here that makes a huge difference. The feminists pulled it off. Feminists achieved what Hitler could only fucking dream of. Like, you have to understand this. Like, had Hitler successfully implemented a JQ-style threat narrative to the same degree, and for it to be accepted to the degree and unquestioned to the degree that patriarchy theory was accepted, then we'd all be speaking German right now. Like, there would not have been any resistance. No one would stand. They'd be like, oh yeah, well, I mean, you know what I mean? There'd be no moral high ground for people to say that the Nazis were bad, which is kind of crazy to think about, right? So the feminist patriarchy theory, it's unsupported, targets so many people, and people buy into it. And then look at it this way. Look at all of the entire gender conversation. We've had men's issues for as long as there have been women's issues. You can look up all kinds of things from under coverture laws that are really unfair. And most of the claims that feminists or women's rights advocates complain about, they always ignore the other half of it. And they only focus on the part that has to do with female suffering. And it's because they legitimately only really perceive and value the elimination of female suffering and not of male suffering. I don't believe that patriarchy theory has actually had the sole influence. I think that it's merely accelerated and reinforced things that are already in there. And basically, because we had these gynocentric preferences at the core, where women prefer each other and men prefer women, in terms of like benevolent treatment, you could call it benevolent sexism. Because we have those, that's why the MQ was so easily digested. People heard it and said, oh yeah, of course. Or their self-interest, their own priorities, the things that they want themselves, they had a conflict of interest. For men, it may have been, oh, well, this is a way for me to, in an effectual fashion, to kind of discredit other men and then rise to the top of the hierarchy. And for women, it's a way to secure benefits exclusively for their own group with no regard for how it affects men or whether or not it's free and equal or whether or not it's consistent with the principles by which they are claiming that giving women's rights are the justification for. So that's my point for today. In a nutshell, feminist patriarchy theory is the JQ that everyone bought into. And we bought into it to such a degree that we don't even see it that way. I maintain that it is the most evil threat narrative, the most evil anti-human narrative that's currently in play, just in terms of the number of people that it targets and in terms of how effective it is, and then considering how unfounded and how ridiculous it is. I think there's no question. I don't think it's ridiculous at all to compare feminists to Nazis. And if that's wrong to do, I need to see the facts, because honestly, it really seems like, there is an apples to oranges comparison in the fact that feminists aren't directly responsible for as many deaths. However, when you look at the suicide rate and then consider the degree to which our mental health has been geared to exclusively cater to women, when you look at the criminal justice system and the number of men who are in there for sentences that, relative to their female counterparts are like double. There was that Permutation of Ninjas article where he tried to reverse engineer all of our preferences in order to determine that, it's possible that the discrepancy between men and women in prison could solely be due to sexism. I'm not sure if the evidence is necessarily there for that to be true. Obviously, that's a very, very extreme and contentious claim. But there's a lot of reasons that it might be true. There's a lot of reasons that I can't just straight up doubt that if men and women were treated equally in the prison system, that we would see 50-50 men and women in jail. But basically, you can take these large-scale men's rights issues, and I don't think it's unfair to say that women's advocates, people of the women's movement, feminists, people who say they focus on gender issues without an explicit focus on men, either they don't know what they're doing because they have absolutely no pulse on issues that matter in terms of just measuring like human suffering and human life. These are not priorities. Ignorance is the best excuse they have, but I just don't see that excuse anymore, because it's always been the case that we've had men's issues and they've always been ignored. So how many generations does it take for a fucking audit? Like, how many generations does it take? One of the reasons I'm bringing this issue up is because it's part of a consistent issue I'm noticing within anti-feminism, and I call it coffee shop anti-feminism. And basically what it is people see some rabid SJW radical feminist, and then they assume, oh, well, you might have some good points, but you're just so radical that I don't believe it. Essentially, they go for the tone police. It happens on the other side of it. And this is kind of like the low-level anti-feminism that you see among traditionalists, where, they see like some feminist cringe compilation or someone with blue hair and a sign and they just mock them or whatever. But the conversation is so much deeper than that, because the reason that these people are wrong, it's not their logic. It's their facts. They believe facts that are wrong, and most anti-feminists don't attack the fucking source. Instead, you just attack the tone. So, for example, if the things that they think are true, if they truly believe in this patriarchy theory that's totally oppressive and that everything's super unfair, yeah, their reaction is totally reasonable. And it's totally reasonable for them to be rabid and pissed off and angry and to have crazy fucking hair and just do shit for attention. Like, it actually kind of makes sense. The issue is not a matter of logic or a matter of tone. The issue is a matter of facts. And that's why I believe that the only real way to address gender issues is first from a perspective of rigid anti-feminism, rejects all waves of it, because it got off on the wrong foot from the very beginning, and this was never corrected. We can't have an anti-feminism that's strictly anti-third wave or strictly anti-SJW, because all you're doing is you're granting them the facts that justify their emotional reaction and then just criticizing their emotional reaction. I say go to the source. And likewise, when I say, I don't think that feminists compare favorably to Nazis, I think that they're worse. I think that in the future, we're going to look back at feminism as one of the most egregious violations of human rights that's ever existed, partially due to just how long it's fucking gone on. Like imagine multiple generations of Nazis and multiple generations of death camps. The feminist bullshit has been going on and on and on, and it shows no sign of ending. It really doesn't, because it seems that what's happening is the anti-SJW narrative that's overtaking it is not actually addressing the problem, because it's not holding previous generations accountable. It's not holding the first and second wave accountable. So my challenge to anyone is, show me how I'm unfair. Show me that it's not fair to say to someone, if you identify as a feminist in current year 4, that's like unironically identifying as a Nazi. Except that might not be fair to Nazis.